It was 2:47 in the morning. The lobby was silent. The kind of silence that settles into old hotels like dust settles into old carpet. Slow, heavy, and impossible to shake. The night receptionist, a man named Gerald, was doing what he always did at that hour. He was updating the occupancy log, sipping cold coffee, watching the seconds crawl across the clock above the elevator bank. And then the phone rang. Not the main desk line, not the line from room service or housekeeping or the loading dock around the back. The call was coming from inside the hotel, from a room. Gerald leaned forward and looked at the display panel on the switchboard. The little green number blinked at him like a heartbeat. Room 419. He answered, said the usual words. "How can I help you this evening?" Standard. Practiced. Warm. Silence. Not the silence of a bad connection. Not static, not a muffled voice, not a wrong number trailing off into embarrassment. Just silence. Clean silence. The kind that has weight to it. The kind that makes you feel like something on the other end of the line is listening just as hard as you are. Gerald held the phone for a long moment. He said hello again. Nothing. He hung up and made a note in the log. Called from 419 at 2:47. No response. He assumed a guest had bumped the phone in the dark. He went back to his occupancy sheet. And that was when he saw it. Room 419 was not listed as occupied. It hadn't been listed as occupied for a very long time. In fact, when Gerald checked the broader booking system, cross-referencing the room against the night's arrivals and the week's reservations, he found something that made him read the screen twice, then a third time. Room 419 had not been officially occupied for 11 years. Gerald sat back in his chair and looked at the phone. It sat on the desk, perfectly still, perfectly ordinary. He told himself there was a simple explanation. There always was. A maintenance crew finishing a late job, maybe. A housekeeper who had slipped inside to restock supplies. A crossed wire somewhere in the old building's telephone system, ancient and patched together over decades. He told himself all of this. And he almost believed it. Almost. Because even as he was reasoning it through, constructing his tidy little explanation brick by brick, one thought kept slipping through the cracks. A thought he could not quite bury. Gerald had been the only one working that night. He had watched the front door since midnight. He had the only key to the elevator override panel, which was required to access the 4th floor after 10 p.m., when the elevator was set to bypass that landing automatically. Nobody had gone up to the 4th floor. He was certain of it. And yet something in room 419 had picked up the phone and called him. To understand what happened in room 419, you have to understand the building itself. Because old hotels are not just buildings. They are organisms. They breathe. They remember. And the Grandeur Hotel, standing at the corner of Aldwych and Marlow Street in the old downtown district, had been breathing and remembering for a very long time. It opened in 1922. The original brochure, which still exists in the city's historical archive, described it as a palace of quiet refinement. 11 stories of limestone and dark brick, 143 guest rooms, a grand ballroom on the 2nd floor, a rooftop terrace that overlooked the cathedral's spire 3 blocks north. In its early decades, the hotel was the kind of place that attracted traveling dignitaries, wealthy merchants, theater companies passing through on long tours. It was the kind of place where you checked in and felt, almost immediately, that you were part of something larger than yourself. By the 1980s, the grandeur had faded. Only in name did the hotel still carry that original promise. Several ownership changes, a failed renovation in the mid-90s, and the slow economic erosion of the surrounding neighborhood had stripped the hotel of its earlier shine. The ballroom became a storage facility. The rooftop terrace was sealed off after a railing inspection failed. The rooms were clean but tired. The staff was reliable but thin. The kind of hotel that business travelers chose not because it was special, but because it was available and affordable and close enough to the convention center. The fourth floor, in particular, had always been slightly different from the rest. Former staff members, speaking years later to a local journalist who was investigating the hotel's history, would describe the fourth floor as the quiet floor. Not because it was marketed that way, just because it felt that way. The carpet up there was older than on the other floors, a deep burgundy that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. The hallway lighting had always been slightly dimmer, a fact attributed variously to older wiring, lower wattage bulbs, or simply the way the building's structure blocked the natural light from the windows at either end. And room 419 sat at the far eastern end of that hallway, the last door before the stairwell, the room farthest from the elevator. A standard double, according to the hotel's own records. 2 beds, a writing desk, a wardrobe, a bathroom with the clawfoot tub that had never been replaced during the renovations because it was, structurally, too difficult to remove. The room had a window that overlooked the narrow service alley between the hotel and the neighboring insurance building. Not a glamorous view, a private one. Gerald had worked at the Grandeur for 6 years by the time of the first call. He knew the building the way you come to know any place where you spend most of your waking hours. He knew which floorboards creaked on the second landing. He knew which elevator had the slower door. He knew the particular sound that the heating system made when it cycled on in winter. A low industrial groan that guests sometimes called down to complain about in the early hours of November mornings. He had never had a reason to think about room 419 before that night. After the call, he could think of little else. Gerald did not report the incident immediately. He sat with it for several days, the way you sit with something that troubles you, but that you cannot quite justify calling a problem. He had made his note in the log. He had checked the system. He had confirmed, at least to his own satisfaction, that no guest was registered in room 419. In the absence of any further incident, there was nothing official to report. An unexplained call from an empty room could be, as he told himself several times, the result of any number of mundane technical failures. So he waited. He watched. He came in for his night shifts and he did his work, and he found himself, around 2 a.m. each night, glancing at the switchboard more frequently than usual. 11 nights after the first call, it happened again. 2:51 a.m. The same green blink. The same room number. 419. Gerald answered immediately this time. He was ready for it. He said hello, announced the hotel's name, asked how he could assist, and again the silence came. But this time he stayed on the line longer. He did not speak again. He simply listened. And in that listening, in those long, stretched seconds with the phone pressed against his ear, he became aware of something he had not noticed the first time. The silence was not completely empty. There was something in it. Not a voice, not breathing exactly. More like the sound of a room. The ambient pressure of an enclosed space. The particular acoustic quality that every room has. The way sound bounces off walls and furniture and ceiling in its own unique pattern. Gerald had spent enough nights in quiet buildings to recognize that quality. and what he heard on the other end of the line sounded exactly like a room. A real, physical room. Not a dead line, not a system echo. Something was there. And whatever it was not speaking. He stayed on the line for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, according to the phone system's internal log, which would become significant later. Then he hung up. And this time, he did not write it off. He sat down, and he wrote a full incident report, detailing both calls, the dates and times, the room number, the duration, the absence of any registered guest. He left it in the manager's inbox before his shift ended. The day manager, a practical woman named Renata, read the report that morning. Her initial response was entirely reasonable. She asked the maintenance department to check the telephone wiring on the 4th floor. A technician went up that same afternoon. He checked every junction box on the floor, tested each room's handset, examined the cable routing back to the main switchboard. He found nothing wrong. Renata had the booking system double-checked as well. Room 419 was confirmed as unoccupied. It had, in fact, been in a designation category that the hotel internally called long-term hold, a bureaucratic classification typically applied to rooms undergoing extended maintenance or awaiting specialized renovation. The room had been in that category for so long that the original reason for the designation had been lost somewhere in the transition between ownership groups. Nobody currently on staff knew why room 419 was being held, and nobody, it turned out, had a key that was confirmed to still work in its lock. 3 more calls came in the following 2 weeks. Always late at night. Always between 2 and 3 in the morning. Always from the same room. And always the same silence waiting on the other end. Gerald began keeping his own private log, separate from the official incident reports. He noted the precise time of each call, the duration of the silence, whether there was any variation in the ambient sound quality he had noticed. He was not sure why he was doing this. It was not part of his job. But something about the regularity of it, the absolute mechanical precision of its repetition, would not let him leave it alone. The calls were not random. That was what unsettled him most. They fell within the same 30-minute window every single time, between 2:30 and 3 a.m. Not once did a call come at midnight, or 1 a.m., or 4 in the morning. It was always that specific window, as if whatever was generating these calls was operating on a schedule. Management, now taking the situation more seriously, requested that the hotel's internal security system be reviewed. The grandeur had a network of cameras covering all main corridors, the lobby, the stairwells, and the elevator interiors. The footage from the 4th floor hallway was pulled and examined for each night on which a call had been recorded. The hallway was empty. Every time. Not empty in the way a hallway is empty when everyone is asleep and doors are closed. Empty in an absolute sense. Not a shadow moving across the floor. Not a door shifting slightly on its hinges. Not a figure visible at any point in the hour surrounding each call. The hallway camera showed a long, still corridor, with its dim lighting and its burgundy carpet, and nothing else. No one had entered or exited room 419 on any of those nights. Gerald watched the footage himself. He sat with Renata and the head of security, a careful man named Douglas, and they watched the hallway feed from each night in question. They watched it at normal speed. They watched it slowed down. They looked for artifacts in the recording, glitches, frame drops, anything that might indicate a gap or an edit in the footage. There was nothing. A room was generating phone calls. No one was entering or leaving that room. The telephone wiring had been checked and declared functional. The phone inside the room, it was now confirmed, was physically connected to the hotel's main system. When the room's number appeared on the switchboard, it meant the handset inside that room had been lifted from its cradle. The system did not generate phantom call signals. The phone had to have been physically picked up. Douglas said it quietly, almost to himself, after they finished reviewing the last of the footage. He said, "Something is picking up that phone." No one in the room responded, because there was nothing to say to that. Not yet. The hotel's general manager, a man named Philip, made the decision to formally investigate the history of room 419. Not because he believed anything supernatural was occurring, he was at pains to say this to his staff multiple times, but because he believed there was a rational explanation somewhere in the hotel's past, and that finding it was the most efficient way to resolve the situation and stop it from becoming a source of anxiety among the night staff. He commissioned a search of the hotel's physical records. The grandeur had survived multiple ownership transitions, and each new ownership group had, to varying degrees of diligence, retained the paperwork of its predecessors. The records room in the hotel's basement was a long, low-ceiling space filled with filing cabinets and cardboard archive boxes, many unlabeled, most undisturbed for years. A junior manager named Sarah was assigned to begin working through the materials relevant to room 419. It took her 4 days. What she found, eventually, was a guest registration card from 19 years prior. A physical card, the old kind, filled in by hand at check-in. The kind of record that predated the hotel's digital booking system. The name on the card was a man's name, first initial only, followed by a surname. The surname was Marin. He had checked in on a Thursday in late October. His home address was listed as a town approximately 200 miles north. He had paid in cash upon arrival. 3 nights, standard rate. The notation in the margin of the card, written in a different handwriting from the check-in entry, was what stopped Sarah. She stared at it for a long time before she brought it upstairs to Philip. It said, "Guest did not check out. Room cleared by staff on day 4. That was all. No further explanation. No incident report attached. No note about whether the guest had left belongings behind, or whether anyone had attempted to contact him, or whether his unexplained departure had been reported to anyone outside the hotel. The card had simply been filed away, in a box with dozens of other cards from the same period, and forgotten. Philip held the card and read it 3 times. A guest who had not checked out. A room that had been cleared by staff and then, for reasons now obscured by the passage of time and ownership changes, placed on long-term hold, and apparently never reassigned. A phone inside that room that was, according to the technology that monitored it, being lifted from its cradle in the small hours of the morning. He asked Sarah to find out everything she could about the guest named Marin. She began with the address on the registration card. She also asked, quietly, whether any incident from that period had been recorded in the town's local news. She was not sure what she was looking for. She told Philip she would know it when she found it. She was right about that. But what she found was not what any of them had been expecting. The address listed on the registration card turned out to be a residential street in a small market town that Sarah was able to identify through a combination of old postal directories and regional map records. She was not able to confirm at this stage whether the address itself had ever corresponded to a real occupant by the name of Marin. That would require more time and more resources than she currently had. But she did find the news item. It appeared in the digital archive of a regional newspaper, approximately 210 miles north of the hotel. The article was dated 19 days after the check-in date on the registration card. It was a short article, the kind of article that appears in the local pages between a council planning notice and an advertisement for a farm auction. It reported that a man had been found. He had been discovered in a wooded area approximately 12 miles outside the town, several weeks after he had last been seen by anyone who knew him. The cause of death, the article stated carefully, was under investigation. His name was given in full. His first name began with the initial that appeared on the hotel's registration card. His surname was Marin.
The article noted that he had not been reported missing for some time after his disappearance, because those who knew him assumed he had gone traveling. He was, by the article's description, a solitary man, private, prone to long absences, the kind of person whose absence takes a while to register as wrong. The coroner's report, which Sarah was able to access through a public records request that took another several days to process, concluded that the cause of death was consistent with exposure and isolation. He had been in the woods for some time before he was found. There was no evidence of foul play, the report stated. No evidence of another party's involvement. The death was recorded as unexplained, pending further inquiry. And that inquiry, as far as the record showed, had never been formally closed. He had checked into room 419 on a Thursday in October. He had not checked out. His body was found 19 days later, in a different county entirely, in a wood. Sarah brought all of this to Philip. She laid the documents on his desk in a careful sequence. Registration card, newspaper article, coroner's summary. Philip read through everything slowly. Then he sat back and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said only this: "When did he leave the hotel?" And that was the question nobody could answer. The room had been cleared on day 4 of his stay. That meant at some point between his Thursday arrival and the following Sunday, he had left room 419. Whether he left on his own, or whether something else had happened in that room before he left, or whether the sequence of events the record suggested was even the correct one, none of that was clear. What was clear was that the room had been sealed and left untouched ever since, and it was still receiving calls. Or rather, it was still making them. The decision to physically enter room 419 was made after the 8th call. By this point, the situation had moved beyond the night staff and the management team. The hotel's owner, a property investment group that operated several hotels in the region, had been briefed. Their response had been cautious but practical. Investigate, resolve, document. Do not allow the situation to escalate into something that affects the hotel's reputation or its staff's sense of security. A locksmith was brought in to assess the room's lock. The hotel's standard master key system had been updated at some point during one of the ownership transitions, and the key profile for room 419 had not been carried over. Whether this was an oversight or a deliberate decision, no one could say. The locksmith spent 20 minutes with the lock before confirming he could open it without damage to the door or frame. Douglas, the head of security, was present. Philip was present. Gerald, who had requested to be there on his day off, was also present. They stood in the 4th floor corridor at 10 o'clock in the morning. The hallway was quiet in the particular way it always was. The burgundy carpet absorbed their footsteps. The lighting was its usual dim amber. At the far end, room 419 waited. The locksmith opened the door. The smell hit them first. Not decay, not rot, just stillness. The particular smell of a room that has been sealed for a very long time. Old air, dust, the faint ghost of cleaning products applied years ago. Philip reached in and turned on the light. The room was exactly as a room should be after 11 years of no occupancy. Dust on every surface, thick and undisturbed. The bed covers smooth, the way housekeeping leaves them. The wardrobe doors closed.
the writing desk bare.
The curtains, heavy and dark, pulled across the window. A glass on the bathroom sink, still inverted on the edge of the basin, the way housekeeping places them. Gerald walked to the writing desk. He stood in front of it and looked at the phone. It was a standard hotel telephone, beige plastic, the older style, with a coiled cord connecting the handset to the base unit. Covered in dust. Sitting in its cradle, handset down, exactly as it should be. Nothing about it was unusual. Nothing about it indicated it had been touched. Gerald did not pick it up. He looked at it for a long time. Douglas was examining the room's wall connections, following the phone cable from the base unit along the skirting board to the wall jack. He checked the connection, confirmed it was seated correctly. He took photographs of everything. They were all in the room together, having this quiet, methodical investigation, when they became aware of a sound. The phone rang. All four of them turned to look at it. The handset was in its cradle. The phone was ringing. On the switchboard downstairs, Sarah, who had stayed at the front desk to monitor the system, watched the display panel blink to life. Room 419, outgoing call. She picked up the hotel line and listened. Silence. In the days that followed the inspection of room 419, the hotel brought in a telecommunications engineer. His name was Frank, and he had 30 years of experience in commercial telephone infrastructure. He was not a man who entertained mysteries. He was a man who believed that every anomaly had a cause, and that the cause was always, in the end, electrical. He spent 2 full days examining the hotel's telephone system, beginning at the main exchange in the basement and working his way up through each floor's junction boxes, to the 4th floor specifically. What he found was interesting. Not alarming, he was careful to say. Interesting. The hotel's telephone wiring was, in places, extremely old. Some of the cable runs dated to the original 1920s installation, wrapped in the old cloth and rubber insulation that had been standard in that era. Over the decades, newer cable had been spliced into the old where necessary, creating a system that was technically functional, but architecturally complicated. A kind of archaeological record of every telephone upgrade the hotel had ever received, layer upon layer. In the junction box serving the 4th floor, Frank found something he described as a phantom loop. It was a wiring configuration, unintentional, that had almost certainly been created during one of the cable splicing operations sometime in the 1980s or 90s. The loop created conditions under which, under certain circumstances, a small electrical current could be induced in the line serving room 419. Not enough current to generate an actual voice signal, but potentially enough to trigger the hotel's switchboard to register an active call originating from that line. Frank presented this explanation to Philip with quiet confidence. He said it would explain the calls. He said that environmental factors, temperature variations, electromagnetic interference from other equipment in the building, could cause the phantom loop to activate periodically. He said the timing, always late at night, could be related to the hotel's heating system cycling down, causing temperature drops that affected the old cable's conductivity. It was a complete explanation. It was coherent. It was grounded in real electrical theory. Philip thanked him and authorized the repair. Frank spent a day correcting the wiring fault, replacing the compromised section of cable with new material, eliminating the phantom loop. He tested the system before he left. Everything was clean. Room 419's line was verified to be inactive and isolated, exactly as it should be for an unoccupied room. The call stopped. For 19 days, nothing happened. Gerald came in for his shifts and watched the switchboard, and the green light from room 419 did not appear. The staff began to relax. Renata told Gerald over a quiet coffee that she thought it was over. He agreed with her. He said he was glad to have a sensible answer. He said it had been bothering him more than he had been willing to admit. On the 20th night, at 2:53 in the morning, the switchboard lit up. Room 419. Gerald stared at the display for a long moment before he answered. And when he did, and the silence came flooding through the line like cold water, he did not speak. He just held the phone. And in the silence, he heard it again. That ambient presence, that quality of an enclosed space, the sense of a room on the other end of the line. He sat there, holding the phone, and he understood that Frank's explanation, as thorough and credible as it had not been the right one. The weeks that followed were the most difficult period for the hotel staff. Management had made a decision, communicated quietly and without drama, that room 419 would be permanently taken out of service. Not held in the long-term designation category, as it had been, but formally decommissioned. The telephone line serving the room was to be physically disconnected at the junction box. Not simply isolated. Disconnected. Frank was brought back to perform the work, and he did so without comment, cutting the cable cleanly and capping the ends. He confirmed before he left that the line was dead. He tested it with a line checker. No signal. No continuity. The room's telephone was now, by any physical measure, completely inert. The calls had already stopped by this point. They had continued for 6 more nights after the phantom loop repair, and then they had ceased. Just as inexplicably as they had begun, Gerald documented each one. The times, the durations, his observations about the silence on the other end. He filed these reports not because he thought they would lead anywhere, but because he believed they should exist. That someone, at some point, should know exactly what had happened, and in what sequence. Philip began the process of consulting with the property group's legal team about the history of the room and the guest named Marin. Whether there were obligations to report the historical records to anyone, whether the coroner's open inquiry from 19 years prior should be informed of the hotel's registration records. These conversations moved slowly through the proper channels, as such conversations do. Life at the hotel returned to something approaching normal. Gerald finished his 6-month review and received a good evaluation. Sarah was promoted to an administrative role that better suited her research skills. Douglas retired at the end of the winter season. New staff came in. The 4th floor remained accessible and occupied on the other rooms, and guests staying up there reported nothing unusual, because there was nothing unusual to report. Room 419 sat empty and silent at the end of the corridor. Its door closed, its phone disconnected, its dust undisturbed. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late spring, nearly 4 months after Frank had disconnected the line, Renata was reviewing the hotel's telephone system log as part of a routine monthly audit. The log was a digital record maintained automatically by the switchboard software. It recorded every call made through the hotel's internal system, with timestamps, room numbers, duration, and call type. Renata ran her usual scan. Checked for any anomalies. Confirmed everything was in order. And then she scrolled back. For reasons she would later say she could not fully explain, to the date 4 months prior, the night Frank had disconnected the line. She looked at the entries around the time of the disconnection. There was one outgoing call logged after the disconnection. The timestamp put it at 3:14 in the morning, approximately 2 hours after Frank had left the building. The call had originated from room 419. Duration, 6 minutes and 41 seconds. No destination number was recorded because the system did not log internal ambient calls that way. Just the room number. Just the timestamp. Just the duration. 6 minutes and 41 seconds on a line that had been physically cut. Renata printed the log page. She put it in a folder. She sat for a very long time at her desk, looking at it. Eventually, she brought it to Philip. He looked at it for an equally long time. He had no explanation. Frank, when contacted, had no explanation. The switchboard software manufacturer, when the log was sent to their technical team, had no explanation. They said the data entry should not have been possible given the line status. They said it appeared to be an error in the logging system itself, though they could not identify the source of the error or reproduce it. The folder went into the hotel's archive, in a box, on a shelf, with the other things nobody could explain. Some mysteries do not resolve. They do not end with a confession or a discovery or a moment of clarity that reframes everything that came before. They simply stop. The way sound stops. The way a conversation stops when someone leaves the room and does not come back. And what remains is not an answer. What remains is a shape. The outline of something that happened, traced in fragments and timestamps and unanswered questions. Gerald left the hotel 2 years after the calls began. He took a position at a different property across the city. He did not leave because of what had happened. He left because a better opportunity presented itself, and he was ready for it. That is what he told people. That is what he continued to tell people. And it is probably the truth. He kept his private log, not because he planned to do anything with it, not because he believed he would ever find an answer inside it. He kept it because he had been there. He had been the one sitting at the desk in the small hours, watching the green light blink. He had been the one who listened to the silence. He felt, in some way he never tried to articulate to anyone, that the record of what had happened should survive somewhere. That it mattered, even if he could not say exactly why. The man named Marin remained, officially, a subject of an unclosed inquiry. The documents Sarah had found were eventually passed to the relevant authorities, quietly and through proper channels. Whether those authorities found them useful, or whether they simply added them to a file that had long since been considered dormant, was not something the hotel was ever formally told. The inquiry remained open, as these things sometimes do. Technically active, practically forgotten. Room 419 was eventually renovated. It took 3 more years and 2 more ownership transitions before the property group finally authorized the work. New carpet, new paint. The old clawfoot tub, which proved as difficult to remove as its previous generations had assumed, was refurbished in place. A new telephone was installed, connected to the hotel's updated digital system. The room was designated ready for occupancy and entered into the booking rotation. It receives guests now, ordinary guests, business travelers mostly. The occasional couple passing through on the way to somewhere else. Nobody has reported anything unusual. The phone in room 419 functions exactly as it should, receiving calls from the front desk, connecting to room service and the outside line. Nobody who stays there now knows the room's history. There is nothing on the walls, or in the furniture, or in the air to tell them. And yet, the hotel's current telephone log system, a modern cloud-based platform installed during the latest renovation cycle, maintains historical records going back to its installation date. The records before that, including the logs from Gerald's years, were archived in the old digital system, and are still accessible to management on request. Renata, before she retired, made a copy of everything. The incident reports, the phone logs, the archive printout with the 6-minute call that happened after the line was cut. She put it all on a thumb drive. She gave it to the hotel's general archive. She labeled it simply with the room number and the date range. Nobody has opened that folder since she retired. The corridor on the 4th floor is quiet. The carpet has been replaced, a soft gray now instead of the old burgundy. The lighting is brighter. On a busy weekend, you can hear guests in the rooms on either side of 419. The hum of the ice machine at the end of the hall, the distant sound of the elevator arriving at the landing. Ordinary sounds. The ordinary sounds of an occupied hotel. And sometimes, very late at night, in the particular stillness of 2:50-something in the morning when the heating has cycled down and the building has gone as quiet as it ever goes, the night receptionist at the front desk glances at the switchboard. Just glances. Just to check. The world is full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join me as we explore the stories that hide in plain sight. Some of them might haunt you.